shadow of the Dakota Building in New York, a lone figure stands in the cold night, the city lights flickering faintly in the distance. He's John Lennon, but not the one we typically think of, the cheerful peace advocate or the genius musician. This John Lennon is much more complicated, a man caught in the tension between his artistic brilliance and his personal demons. Cigarette smoke swirls around him, and the harsh, dim light seems to capture the storm inside him. The world knew him as the voice of peace, but there was always another side to Lennon, one filled with anger, frustration, and contradictions. In his eyes, you see not just the visionary, but a deeply conflicted man trying to reconcile his dreams with his flaws. Was he truly the revolutionary genius we remember, or was he simply a troubled man, wrestling with his own contradictions and the darkness within him? The answer isn't as simple as either label suggests. John Lennon's early life was a turbulent one, shaped by hardship, loss, and a working-class environment that both fueled and reflected his rebellious nature. Born in 1940 in the working-class area of Liverpool, Lennon's childhood was marked by the early abandonment of his father and the eventual death of his mother, Julia. His father, Alfred, walked out when Lennon was only an infant, and his mother's tragic passing when Lennon was 17 would have a lasting impact. Raised by his aunt and uncle, Lennon never truly felt the warmth of a stable family unit, which only deepened his anger and rebellious spirit. Liverpool, post-WTO, was a city still dealing with the scars of war and economic decline. The environment fostered a generation of angry young men, and Lennon was no exception. He channeled his frustrations into his love for music, and by his teens, he was already exhibiting his sharp wit and biting humor, traits that would become staples of his personality. But his talent for music was his escape, and while Lennon's personality was abrasive, his musical vision was starting to take shape. His early experiences, particularly in school, left Lennon with a deep distrust of authority. He was often in trouble for his sarcastic remarks and rebellious behavior. Yet, this environment, this struggle against authority, would lay the groundwork for his future, both as an artist and a political figure. His working-class roots also made him keenly aware of social issues, a perspective that would be reflected in his lyrics and activism later in life. Lennon's youth was marked by contradictions. He was a troublemaker, but music gave him a purpose. He was angry at the world, but started to discover how music could serve as an outlet for that rage. These early formative years would not only influence his musical career, but would also shape the icon Lennon would become, one deeply tied to his roots, but constantly questioning the system that produced him. Lennon's rise to fame began in earnest when he co-founded the Beatles, one of the most influential and successful bands in history. It was in 1957 when he met Paul McCartney, and the chemistry between them was immediate. Their partnership became one of the most powerful songwriting duos of all time. Their collaboration began to reshape rock and pop music, beginning with their early hits in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Together, they introduced a new era of songwriting, one that was no longer just about catchy tunes, but about deeper emotional connection and experimental studio techniques. The Beatles' rise to global fame was unprecedented, and Lennon's distinctive voice and lyrics were integral to their success. As the band's frontman, Lennon's bold, often introspective lyrics helped redefine the possibilities of popular music. Songs like Strawberry Fields Forever and A Day in the Life pushed the boundaries of what was possible within the confines of a pop song. Lennon's songwriting evolved, moving beyond simplistic love songs to embrace more complex themes such as self-reflection, existential questioning, and social commentary. It was during this period that Lennon's vision of music as a vehicle for cultural change began to take shape. He was not just a musician, he was an artist seeking to make a statement. While the Beatles' music evolved over the years, Lennon's voice remained one of the most influential in popular music. Their sound became synonymous with a generation that was pushing against the traditional norms of society, both musically and socially. Despite the massive success, Lennon's internal conflicts were bubbling beneath the surface. The more successful the Beatles became, the more Lennon's frustrations with fame, the pressures of being in the public eye, and his growing desire to use his platform for social change began to manifest. These internal tensions would eventually lead to his departure from the band in the late 1960s, but by then, he had already cemented his legacy as one of the most influential musicians in history. After the Beatles disbanded in 1970, John Lennon embarked on a solo career that allowed him to fully express his personal struggles, ideals, and political beliefs. His first album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, was a stark departure from the polished pop music of his past. It was raw, confessional, and brutally honest. The album explored deep personal trauma and inner turmoil, with songs like Mother and Isolation laying bare Lennon's pain and vulnerability. He was no longer the confident, cheeky Beatle. He was an artist stripped of pretense, confronting his inner demons. But it was Imagine that truly solidified Lennon as a cultural figure. The title track became an anthem for peace and social change, with its idealistic lyrics calling for a world without borders, possessions, or divisions. The song captured the spirit of the times and cemented Lennon's status as a global peace icon. It also established him as someone willing to use his platform to push for societal change, a message that resonated with millions around the world. Lennon's activism didn't stop with music. He became increasingly vocal about his opposition to the Vietnam War, his anti-nationalism, and his desire for global peace. His famous Bed-ins for Peace with Yoko Ono became emblematic of his non-violent approach to protest. He used his celebrity status as a weapon against war and injustice, drawing attention to causes that were often overlooked. But his activism was not without its challenges. Lennon's outspokenness earned him enemies, including the U.S. government, which viewed him as a threat. His vocal opposition to the war in Vietnam and his critique of the U.S. government's policies led to FBI surveillance and a lengthy legal battle to keep him in the country. Lennon's peace activism, while well-intentioned, also led to personal and professional challenges that would define much of his life outside of music. Lennon's rebellious nature and anti-establishment sentiment only grew stronger as his fame did. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Lennon became a leading figure in the counterculture movement, using his fame to challenge traditional political, social, and cultural structures. He was an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, nationalism, and conventional politics. His activism wasn't just limited to protest songs like Give Peace a Chance or public rallies. It became a defining part of his identity. His Bed-in for Peace with Yoko Ono in 1969, a week-long protest during their honeymoon in Amsterdam, became one of the most iconic symbols of his political stance. Lennon's growing political activism was controversial, to say the least. His criticism of the U.S. government, particularly regarding the Vietnam War, led to government surveillance. The Nixon administration saw Lennon as a potential threat, leading to an intense legal battle over his deportation from the United States. His activism wasn't without personal costs. His public stance alienated some of his fans, and his outspoken nature made him a target for conservative media outlets. Still, Lennon persisted, using his fame as a platform for political expression. His iconic "Give Peace a Chance" became a global anthem, solidifying him as a leader of the peace movement. His willingness to put his career on the line for political causes made him a polarizing figure. For some, he was a hero who used his influence to spread messages of peace and social justice. For others, he was a misguided celebrity whose activism had no real impact. But regardless of how one viewed his actions, there was no denying that Lennon was a man who refused to be silenced, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Lennon's creative collaboration with Yoko Ono during the late 1960s and early 1970s was one of the most avant-garde periods of his career. Together, they explored experimental music and unconventional art forms that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in the mainstream music industry. Their work in this period, often referred to as their avant-garde phase, was challenging and polarizing. While some praised their daring, boundary-pushing projects, others found their artistic output bewildering and inaccessible. The couple's collaboration led to the release of several albums, including Unfinished Music Number 1, Two Virgins, which featured the controversial cover art of the two of them naked. The album's music, filled with abstract sound collages, was a far cry from the Beatles' polished pop sound, and it alienated many fans. Their foray into experimental music didn't resonate with everyone, and the commercial failure of many of their projects further distanced them from the mainstream. Despite the backlash, Lennon and Ono's avant-garde work was an important part of Lennon's artistic evolution. This period, while often criticized, marked a shift in Lennon's approach to music and art. He was no longer interested in conforming to the expectations of the mainstream. Instead, he was focused on pushing the limits of what music and art could represent. His partnership with Ono, while controversial and criticized, ultimately expanded the boundaries of what it meant to be a rock star. By embracing the avant-garde, Lennon challenged not just musical conventions, but societal norms, turning his back on commercial success in favor of more personal, experimental forms of expression. Behind the idealistic rhetoric of peace and love that Lennon championed, there was another side to his personality, a darker, more complicated side. Though he became the voice of a generation's peace movement, Lennon's personal life was filled with emotional volatility, substance abuse, and a history of mistreating those closest to him. Lennon's tumultuous relationships, especially his first marriage to Cynthia Lennon, were marked by his emotional instability and, at times, violent tendencies. Cynthia, in her memoirs and several biographers, recounted instances of Lennon's emotional abuse and even physical violence during their marriage. These revelations added layers to Lennon's public persona and showed the contradictions at the heart of his character. Lennon himself later acknowledged the flaws in his behavior. In interviews, he expressed deep regret for his past actions, admitting to mistreating women during his younger years. His acknowledgement of these actions was a rare moment of self-reflection in a public figure whose life was often marked by bravado. Yet, despite his public efforts to atone for his mistakes, the damage had already been done. and his relationships with people like his first wife and his son Julian were permanently affected. This darker side was not just a product of his relationships, but also his internal struggles. Lennon's relationship with his parents, particularly his mother, whom he had lost at an early age, left scars that he never fully healed. His sense of abandonment was something that haunted him throughout his life, manifesting in feelings of anger and self-loathing. In some ways, his public persona as a peace-loving artist was an attempt to overcome these deep-seated emotional wounds. But it was clear that Lennon was still a man grappling with unresolved pain. His violent tendencies, substance abuse, and the pain of his early years continued to shape him well into adulthood. Despite these flaws, Lennon's ability to confront his past in his music was remarkable. His 1970s solo work, particularly the album John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band, was an unflinching look at his emotional and psychological turmoil. The album's raw, confessional nature, with its heartbreaking lyrics and minimalist sound, painted a portrait of a man struggling with his demons. Songs like Mother and Isolation were Lennon's attempt to work through his pain, exposing the vulnerability that lay beneath the tough, rebellious exterior. In many ways, this period marked Lennon's emotional rebirth as he tried to reconcile his public ideals with the darkness in his personal life. But no amount of introspection could fully erase the damage. The strain of living in the public eye while dealing with his personal flaws would continue to haunt Lennon, complicating his legacy as both a genius and a deeply troubled man. In the mid-1970s, Lennon entered what would become known as the Lost Weekend period, an era defined by his erratic behavior, heavy drinking, infidelity, and self-destructive choices. This was a dark chapter in Lennon's life, where the idealist who had once espoused peace and love seemed to unravel in the face of his personal demons. The catalyst for this period was his separation from Yoko Ono. After years of intense collaboration, both personally and artistically, their relationship hit a breaking point. Lennon, emotionally devastated by the separation, began what was essentially a year of excess and reckless behavior. During the Lost Weekend, Lennon had a highly publicized affair with his assistant May Pang, and the period was marked by excessive drinking and parties. For someone who had once been seen as a symbol of peace and enlightenment, this was a stark departure from the persona the public had grown to admire. The chaos of this time was mirrored in Lennon's music. His album, Walls and Bridges from this period, reflected the emotional turmoil and confusion that defined the Lost Weekend. The music was raw and vulnerable, full of self-doubt and anger. It was a reflection of Lennon at his lowest, struggling to make sense of his personal life and the world around him. The public fallout from this period was significant. Fans who had once idolized Lennon were shocked by his behavior, and his image as a moral leader began to crumble. While some viewed his chaotic lifestyle as a form of rebellion or artistic freedom, others saw it as a betrayal of everything Lennon had once stood for. His personal disintegration led to a temporary alienation from his fans, and his music, which had once inspired millions, now seemed to speak to a man in crisis. Yet, even during this period of public disgrace, Lennon continued to make music that resonated with his fans. His personal struggles were laid bare in his music, and that vulnerability, while alienating to some, made him more human and accessible to others. It was during this time that Lennon seemed to embrace the notion that he, too, was a flawed, imperfect individual, an acknowledgement that ultimately made his story even more compelling.